In today's video, I'm going to be outlining my 6 rules for when getting a new pet. So you may be thinking to yourself, what do you need rules for? Like, is that really necessary to have rules in place? And in short, absolutely. If I didn't have these rules in place, I can guarantee you I'd have made some kind of impulse buy by now, some mistake purchase, or I'd have just purchased things that were beyond my capability. So I've had a lot more animals in the past than I do currently, and at some point during my time of keeping animals, I decided it's probably best for me to set up some kind of system that prevents me from doing anything stupid. So I decided to keep it simple and I just came up with rules. So I listed a number of things that I need to take into consideration when I get a new pet. I mean, in all honesty, the reason I have rules is because I'm a crafty bugger. And if these rules weren't in place, I would probably be going to every expo and not necessarily having the intention of buying something, but I'd be at risk of buying something. Keeping reptiles is an addiction. Once you get one, you just kind of go down the route of keep getting more and more and more, because realistically, they're relatively simple to care for most of the time. And they're kind of isolated to their own enclosure, so they're not living within your house like a dog would be. So it can be a little bit misleading. Reptile keeping or exotic keeping, whatever you want to classify it as, because I'd say things like tarantulas and whatnot are in the same boat here, and fish even. It's an addiction. So sympathize with my pain and my struggle. So I have 6 rules that I use when getting a new pet. The pet must pass all 6 rules. It must ace the test. There is no 90s, 80s, 70s. It must ace it without a doubt. No arguing. If it doesn't pass the 6 rules, I can't get the animal. Now I feel like this video may be a little bit hard to follow or misleading maybe, unless I throw in an example. So let's do that. So I plan on getting a pig. Yes, a pig. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the pig through these rules. So you can kind of get an idea as to how I use these rules and how I kind of process the whole system. I'm stuck between 2 names for the pig at the moment, one being Babe and one being Henwin. Let me know in the comments which one you think would be the most suited. It will be a female, by the way. So with the admin done, let's jump into rule 1. The animal cannot kill me. I know this one may sound a little bit silly or obvious, or on the other hand a bit barbaric and stupid, but nevertheless there are a lot of animals that I would love to keep, but with some of them comes an inherent risk factor. I mean, take some of the big snakes for example. Let's use a reticulated python. There's a number of people that keep reticulated pythons, and they are a bloody massive snake, the longest snake in the world. Now I don't know of any stories where one has seriously injured its owner, let alone killed its owner, but in the wild these snakes do occasionally, and I mean occasionally, kill people and maybe even eat people. So what that tells me is that this snake has an inherent risk. Now that's more what this rule is about. I mean, realistically, anything could kill you in the right circumstances, time and whatnot, but I'm talking in a more practical sense. So keeping an animal like a reticulated python means I need to have certain safety procedures in place, safety practices and whatnot for anyone that's exposed to this animal. So whether that's having a second door, so I have like a 2-way entry, maybe having a second person always present if I'm interacting with that animal or if anybody else is. Maybe on feeding day, making sure I have a handful of people around. Maybe certain training procedures need to be done so it's less likely that the animal's going to see me as a food item. It's a very low chance it's going to happen, but the chance is there. So, I'm not getting a reticulated python. So back to the pig. The pig is not as safe as a goldfish, but the pig that I'm looking to get, I would compare to my brother's golden doodle. It can't kill me, at least not that easy. So for that reason, the pig is going to get a tick for rule 1. Rule 2, I must be able to carry or move the animal on my own in the case of an emergency. So this rule is a little naughty because I have manipulated this rule in the past, but we won't go into that. I'll just explain the rule itself. So imagine I have a pet rattlesnake. Now, if you're wondering if I have a pet rattlesnake, go back to rule 1. But imagine I live in an apartment building on the 27th bloody floor and the building's on fire. So I need to evacuate the building. I'm not going to obviously leave my animal behind. Even though they tell you to do that, I'm not going to. I want to obviously save the animal as well. But I need to be able to get that animal downstairs safely so that I don't get bitten. But I mean, this is an easy rule because I just have to have a lockbox within the enclosure or have the enclosure be movable. As long as the snake is isolated inside something, realistically, it passes this rule, right? So tick for the rattlesnake, it would actually pass this rule. It wouldn't pass rule 1, so henceforth I wouldn't be able to have one, but it did pass rule 2. So back to Henwin, or Babe. You know what? I think from this point we'll call it Henwin or Babe. So don't get confused if I alternate that. I'm not going to pay attention. I'm just going to fly. Whichever one comes out, comes out. But henwin is going to probably weigh about 100 pounds. So in the case of an emergency, if I needed to evacuate henwin, I could realistically, she would absolutely hate it, and so would my back, but I could realistically pick her up and carry her outside because she's not too heavy to where I wouldn't be able to carry her in an emergency. But then come to think of it, a better option would probably be to kind of coax her through the door and just kind of have her walk down like a dog. I mean, that would be a lot better for her mental health and my spinal health. But regardless, henwin could get evacuated perfectly fine. So that's another tick. Henwin passes rule 2. Rule 3, I can afford the animal. Now this rule sounds pretty simple, but there's more to it than you're thinking. When I say afford it, I mean afford everything that encompasses that animal. So that means the enclosure, the bedding, or a house and a garden when it comes to a pig anyway. Vaccines, medications, food supply, anything like that. But I'm sure you could all guess that that's what the rule meant. But there's one more aspect to this rule. So we all remember when the world shut down not long ago. So if that was to happen again and my income was to decrease or disappear even, I still need to be able to provide the best life for henwin/babe. So I have an animal emergency fund, AMF. It literally says AMF on the account name. And what that AMF has in it is 1 year's worth of money to supply everything that every animal I have needs for 1 year, which I think I just said. So the value of that animal emergency fund needs to be equivalent to me keeping all my animals for an entire year without changing anything. The food, nothing goes down. It all stays at the same level. I also have a buffer 10% of the total, which is reserved for anything unexpected. So if there was an unexpected increase in the cost of things or a vet visit. So for Babe to pass this rule, I have to know the expenses to keep a pig for a month, times it by 12, add 10% onto that total, then add that to my emergency fund. And that's not including the cost of purchasing her and all the enclosure. That's two different segments of the same rule. So I have to have the emergency fund part and I have to have everything supplied that she needs before I can get her. Now, I know what a pig costs. I know all of the expenses that are required. I know what the pig's going to cost me on a monthly basis. So I know that and I can save up to get all that. I can figure out how much money I need to add to the animal emergency fund. So realistically, I know the values and I can afford the values. So Babe gets a tick. She passes rule 3. Rule 4, my dad could care for this animal. Now what does that even mean, right? So this is my most recent addition to the rules. I know it's rule 4, but the last two are usually the ones that kick most animals out. So I didn't want to put it towards the end. And it's not misleading, it literally means exactly what I just said. My dad could care for this animal. But let me explain it differently so it makes more sense. Let's say I was to travel outside of town, outside of country, whatever the case may be, maybe I get injured, whatever that situation is, I'm not available to look after my animals. So I need to be able to have somebody else come in and look after them. My dad has no desire to look after any of my animals. And I don't know if I'd even ask him because I've got other people that would prefer to do it. But the idea of the rule is that somebody who has no clue about the reptiles that I keep, has no desire to learn, could do it. So you could look at this rule in two ways. The first way, I only keep animals that are ridiculously easy to care for and require very little attention and don't require too much knowledge. So an animal that might fit into that would be like a crested gecko. They don't require an awful lot of attention and it's quite simple to kind of mix up their food, put it in there a couple of times a week, miss the enclosure. It's very easy care, right? I could write a post-it note, put it on the enclosure. He'd be good for the entire time I was away. That's one aspect of it. The second aspect of this rule, which is the one I actually follow, I don't have any crested geckos, I have a frilled lizard. So in regard to the frilled lizard, if I was to have to disappear for a period of time, my dad could look after Gizmo. The reason why is because everything for Gizmo is simple now. Caring for a frilled lizard isn't easy, it's not hard, but there are certain measures that must be in place for that lizard to do well. So all of Gizmo's electronics are on smart plugs. All the main parts of his enclosure are monitored for heat and humidity. And everything's on a thermostat. So the entire enclosure is its own little ecosystem that as long as it has power and nothing malfunctions, it's perfectly capable of running with very little to no aid. Now, he's going to have to provide bugs, but I could divide out certain days into little cups and stack them up beside his enclosure. All he's going to do is put it there, take the lid off, Gizmo will do the rest. So I've made Gizmo's care so easy that my dad could look after him. That's how to look at this rule. It's not that my dad is going to, it's if it came down to it, someone who has no knowledge or practice could do it if the animals are either really easy to look after or you've set everything up super easy. Now, the benefit with a pig for me is I actually know someone who has one. So the pig would probably just go to them. And if it didn't, they're basically just like dogs. They have very, very similar care. Most people that I know, once they become familiar with the pig, would be perfectly capable of looking after it. So Henwin gets a tick for rule 4. I mean, Henwin/Babe is killing this list. We've got 4 rules straight, no problem. I think in my next video, I'm going to have little Henwin right here. She's going to be my co-host. Yeah, no, not so much, because there is rule 5. And rule 5 is I need to have the enclosure perfectly set up before I get the animal. This is where Henwin loses some points. So, for example, with Gizmo, I set up his first little enclosure, which I'll chuck somewhere, or it's the entire screen. I don't know what I'm going to do. But I had that enclosure set up 2 weeks before I even got the bugger. And not just 2 weeks before I even got the bugger, I had it set up, running, and then I went to a reptile expo with the intent of buying a frilled lizard. But if I didn't see one, or I didn't see one that was looking healthy, I wasn't going to get one. In which case, that enclosure may have been sitting there for 4 months. I would have turned everything off. I wouldn't just have it running. But it would have been sitting there until the next expo when I could go and see if I could find another one. Gizmo was fortunately at the expo I went to, so I had that enclosure set up ready before I even had Gizmo. And that actually goes for all the following enclosures that I had, apart from the most recent edit. Every time I upgraded him, I made sure that the enclosure that he was in had been set up for a week or 2, then move him in it. Because it's a new enclosure, I don't know how it's going to hold humidity, how it's going to hold heat, none of that. When we did the Gizmo modification, I didn't set up that enclosure with 2 weeks, because he was only going to be in there for a few days, and I know how that enclosure handles humidity and heat, because I've had him in there before. Now, Henwin's not going to pass this rule. Rule 5's not going to be getting a tick on that list. And the reason for that is because I don't live in a very big house, and I don't have a very big garden. And in that house with not a very big garden, I also have 2 roommates and a dog, and the reptiles. So I don't really have the room for a pig right now. So this is totally my fault. Like, Henwin didn't fail this rule. I failed this rule for Henwin. But the reality is, I'm just not set up at this current time to house a pig successfully. And I just don't have the real estate within the house to house 3 people, a pig, a dog, and reptiles. It's just not enough space. So unfortunately, Babe doesn't get a pass for rule 5. We'll have to put a cross beside that rule. I mean, I'm kind of depressed now. Babe didn't pass the rules. Because remember, the rule of the rules is that you have to get all 6 passed, and she's failed one now through no fault of her own, through fault of me. But I guess there's no real point putting her through rule 6 now, right? I mean, we're gonna do it anyway, but I can't get a pig because she failed rule 5. Rule 6, I need to be a bloody expert on that animal. I need to know more about that animal than Google does. That might not be possible, but I'd be bloody well trying. So unfortunately, I can't tick rule 6 for Henwin either, because I know a fair bit about keeping pigs, and I have a friend that keeps one, so I can realistically feed on their knowledge, but I am far from an expert when it comes to this animal. And the main reason for that is I just haven't been doing research into them, because I know that a pig isn't really on the table for me right now. So because of that, I haven't really been doing much research into it, because I'm not really in a location that could house it successfully. So rule 5 kind of prevents me from putting in the effort to pass rule 6. So she passes 4 rules out of 6. It's just not really enough. And to give you an idea of what I mean by expert, the other day when I was doing some research into them, you have to trim their hooves, not just their tusks. And it's bloody difficult to do. And in most cases, you have to bring a farmer in to do it because they have the right tools. I'm not entirely sure how fast they would grow, because everything I've found online so far kind of throws it all over the place. But that's an expense that I need to take into account, because rule 6 is what basically governs what I do to all the other rules. So let's do a quick review of the rules. It can't kill me. I can move it. I can afford it. My dad could do it. The enclosure is ready, and I'm an expert. So let me know down in the comments if there's any animal that you want, but when you put it through this 6-rule system, failed, and why it failed. I'm curious to know what rules it failed and passed, to see what your kind of game plan is to maybe pass them if it's possible. Because the most important thing is you want to make sure that the animal is the best taken care of possible. So these rules kind of dictate that you don't bring anything in that's beyond your skill level or beyond your affordability level, so that the animal doesn't suffer on any of our behalf. So we've modified Gizmo's enclosure, we've built Greta and Gabby an enclosure, but we need to up it a notch now. In the next video, we're going to be building a room, a snake room.